It was one of those gray mornings when the clouds hung low and the streets shimmered with leftover rain. The city of Atlanta was slowly waking up, lights flickering on in old apartment windows and buses rumbling along their usual routes. In a quiet corner of downtown stood a small diner called Sunnyside Cafe. The place wasn't fancy. Its neon sign flickered and the paint on the door had started to peel, but it had something warm about it. The smell of coffee, the chatter of regular customers, and the sound of clinking cups gave it life. Inside, Tasha Green was already busy behind the counter. She had been there since 6 in the morning, wearing her faded blue apron and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. At 32, Tasha had seen enough of life's rough edges. She had 2 children, Marcus and Kiara, and raising them alone wasn't easy. Her mornings began before sunrise and ended long after her kids had gone to bed. Still, she showed up every day, pouring coffee with care and greeting customers with kindness that came from the heart. She loved the diner, even if it didn't pay much. It was her second home, the place where she listened to people's stories, shared quiet laughter, and sometimes hid her worries behind that polite, practiced smile. She knew almost every face that walked in, from the tired office workers to the old veterans who came for the $3 breakfast special. But that day a new face appeared. Just after 8 o'clock, when the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the door opened, and a tall man in a dark jacket stepped inside. He looked ordinary, jeans, boots, and a baseball cap pulled low. He brushed the rain from his shoulders and glanced around before choosing a seat near the window. Something about him seemed calm yet mysterious, like someone who didn't quite belong, but didn't want to stand out either. "Good morning," Tasha said cheerfully, grabbing her notepad. "What can I get you?" The man looked up, his eyes kind but distant. "Just coffee, please, black." Tasha nodded, coming right up. As she poured the steaming cup, she couldn't help but notice his hands, clean, well-kept, but strong, like someone used to hard work. He didn't pull out his phone like most customers did. Instead, he just stared outside, watching the world go by. When she brought his cup, he thanked her politely and took a sip, as if savoring something more than just the taste. The man's name was Richard Hale, though no one there knew that. To the world, Richard was a billionaire, founder of several companies, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. But he had always been different from other wealthy people. Success had not made him proud, it had made him curious. He often wondered what life looked like from the other side, how people managed when every day was a battle to survive. That curiosity had brought him to Atlanta, to this little diner, dressed like an ordinary man with no trace of wealth on him. He didn't want to be recognized or treated like a VIP. He wanted to listen, to see, to understand. Sometimes he visited schools, sometimes small shops. But today, he had chosen a diner because it was where real stories lived. As he sat quietly, he listened to the soft hum of the place, the sizzle from the kitchen, the laughter of 2 elderly women sharing gossip, and the sound of Tasha's shoes moving across the tiled floor. There was something comforting about it all, something genuine. When Tasha came back to refill his cup, he smiled. "Busy morning?" he asked casually. "Always," she replied, giving a small laugh. "But I can't complain. At least I've got work." Her tone was light, but Richard could hear something beneath it, a quiet exhaustion that only those who had struggled too long could understand. He hesitated for a moment, then asked, "You've been working here long?" "Almost 4 years," she said. "It's not fancy, but it's steady. That's what matters." He nodded slowly. "Steady is good. Sometimes that's worth more than fancy." Tasha chuckled. "You sound like someone who's learned that the hard way." "Maybe," he said, smiling softly. She liked his calmness, the way he spoke without rush or pride. There was warmth in his voice, the kind that made people open up. So, when he asked more questions, about the neighborhood, the customers, and how business was going, she didn't mind answering. "It used to be better," she admitted. "The area's changing. Rents keep going up, people keep moving out. You know how it is?" Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I've heard that story before." "Still," Tasha added, glancing toward the window, "you gotta keep hope. That's what I tell my kids, even when it's hard. Richard smiled again. He admired her spirit, the quiet strength in her words. You sound like a good mom, he said. Tasha's face softened. I try, she whispered. Some days that's all I can do. For a moment they both fell silent. The rain outside picked up again, tapping softly on the glass. Richard looked around, at the chipped tables, the faded menu, the old clock ticking on the wall. He could tell the place was struggling, yet it had a soul that most expensive restaurants never would. He sipped his coffee slowly. It wasn't the best he'd ever had, not even close, but somehow it felt real. It tasted like life, a little bitter, a little warm, and full of truth. Over the next half hour they talked more, about the city, about dreams, about the kind of hope that keeps people moving when the world seems heavy. Tasha spoke about her son, Marcus, who loved to draw superheroes, and her daughter, Kiara, who wanted to be a teacher. She mentioned how she sometimes worked late shifts and left notes for her kids on the kitchen table because she couldn't tuck them in herself. Richard listened closely, not as a billionaire but as a man who had once known hardship too. Before his success, he had been a struggling college dropout, sleeping in his car and surviving on instant noodles. He remembered the loneliness, the uncertainty, the feeling of being invisible. And now, looking at Tasha, he saw the same fire he once carried, quiet, hidden but still burning. When it was time for him to leave, he reached into his pocket and placed a $50 bill under the saucer. Keep the change, he said gently. Tasha blinked. That's too much, she said, shaking her head. It's just coffee. Maybe, he replied, but it's good coffee. She laughed softly, grateful but confused. There was something about him that didn't add up. Most people who left big tips did it to show off, but he didn't seem like that. He looked more like someone who was paying attention. Really paying attention. As he stood up, he reached for his jacket. But just before he could leave, Tasha hesitated. She looked at him, then at the napkin in her hand, and something inside her urged her to act. She quickly scribbled a few words, folded the note, and slipped it under his empty cup when he wasn't looking. Have a good day, sir, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You too, Tasha, he replied, reading her name tag before walking out into the drizzle. The bell over the door jingled softly as it closed behind him. Tasha watched through the fogged window as he walked down the street, blending into the gray morning. For a moment, she wondered if she'd done the right thing. It wasn't something she planned. It just came from her heart. She had written the note quickly, without overthinking. It wasn't about asking for help or pity. It was about faith, the belief that maybe, just maybe, there were still people out there who cared enough to make a difference. Outside, Richard walked to his car parked near the corner. The rain had picked up again, soft but steady. He opened the door, sat inside, and started the engine. Then he noticed the folded note sitting on the dashboard, right where he had placed his cup moments earlier. Curious, he unfolded it. In neat handwriting, it read, If you're ever in a position to make change, please remember people like us. We're still fighting. He stared at the words for a long time. They were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of truth that couldn't be ignored. He read it again, slower this time, feeling something stir inside him. Richard wasn't easily moved. He had seen poverty before, supported charities, and written big checks that changed lives. But this was different. It wasn't a plea. It was a reminder. A quiet voice from someone who still believed in good, even when life hadn't been kind. As he sat there, rain pattering softly on the windshield, he thought of all the people he had met, business partners, politicians, investors, and realized that none of them had ever spoken to his heart the way that short note did. It was honest. It was real. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, as if it were something precious. Then he looked back toward the diner, its faded sign glowing dimly through the mist. At that moment, something changed in him. What had started as a quiet visit to observe had become something personal. He didn't know it yet, But the note in his pocket would soon set off a chain of events that would transform not just a diner, but an entire neighborhood. For now, though, he simply drove away, the note resting close to his heart and the words echoing in his mind. Richard Hale couldn't stop thinking about that note. All day through his meetings and phone calls, his mind kept returning to the words written in that neat, slightly shaky handwriting. If you're ever in a position to make change, please remember people like us. We're still fighting. He must have read it a dozen times. It wasn't the kind of message that asked for anything. No money, no help, no attention. It was a reminder, a simple truth. A quiet voice asking to be seen. That night, as he sat in his hotel room overlooking the city, Richard looked out at the skyline. Tall buildings, bright lights, and shiny cars rushing by. It was the world he knew well, the world he had helped build. But beyond those lights were streets like the one that diner sat on, places most people ignored. Places where hardworking people like Tasha got up before dawn, hoping the next day might be just a little bit better than the last. He took the note from his pocket again and laid it on the table beside his laptop. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had found him for a reason. Richard had always believed in hard work and self-reliance. But now he was realizing something else. That opportunity, real opportunity, wasn't given equally. Some people were fighting battles he couldn't see. He thought about Tasha, her calm smile, her tired eyes, the way she kept her hope alive even when life gave her little reason to. He had met thousands of people in boardrooms and banquets, but her honesty had struck something deep inside him. By the next morning, Richard had made a decision. He was going back. When he returned to the diner 2 days later, the rain had gone, and sunlight poured through the windows. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the sound of laughter came from a small group of regulars near the counter. Tasha almost didn't recognize him at first. He wore the same jacket, same calm smile, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a kind of warmth mixed with purpose. "You again?" she said, smiling as she grabbed a menu. "Back for more coffee?" He chuckled. "Maybe a little more than that." She laughed softly, pouring him another cup. "You must really like our coffee. Most folks just come once and move on." "It's not just the coffee," he said, stirring his drink. "It's the people." Tasha tilted her head, a little surprised by his tone. "Well, we're just doing what we can. Not much choice, really." "Maybe there's more choice than you think," Richard replied, looking around the diner. "Do you mind if I ask who owns this place?" She hesitated, unsure why he'd ask something like that. "It's an old family business. The owner's been trying to sell, I think. Things have been slow lately. Rent's gone up and the bills, well, they never stop." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I can imagine." He sat quietly for a while, sipping his coffee and watching her work. Every time she smiled at a customer or carried a tray, he could see how much effort she put into everything. She wasn't just serving food. She was serving kindness, one plate at a time. When he finished, he left another generous tip, but this time he also left a business card, folded neatly under the saucer. That afternoon, when Tasha cleared the table, she saw it. She frowned a little, thinking he might have left it by accident. The card was simple, elegant, with just one line, "Richard Hale, Hale Industries." She stared at it for a long time, her heart skipping. She had heard that name before. Everyone had. He was one of those names you saw in magazines, the kind of man whose picture was printed next to words like billionaire or philanthropist. For a few seconds, she just stood there, confused. Could it really be him? The man who had sat here in an old jacket, talking about hope and community like any ordinary person. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about their conversations, the way he listened, really listened, without judgment. And now it made sense. He hadn't just been curious, he had been paying attention. 3 weeks passed before she saw him again. By then, rumors had started spreading around the neighborhood. People said someone had bought the old diner, though no one knew who. The owner, a kind old man named Mr. Samuels, had quietly retired and moved out of state. But when the papers came through, the new owner's name surprised everyone. It was Hale Community Ventures, one of Richard's smaller foundations that focused on rebuilding local businesses. On a sunny Monday morning, a black car pulled up outside the diner. Tasha was inside, wiping tables and refilling sugar jars when the door opened. Richard walked in, dressed simply as always, but this time with a look of certainty. "Tasha," he said with a smile, "we need to talk." She froze for a moment, unsure whether to feel nervous or grateful. "About what?" "About this place," he said, glancing around. "It has potential, real potential, but it needs care, and someone who believes in it." She nodded slowly, still unsure where this was going. "I bought the diner," he said simply, "and I'd like you to manage it." Her mouth fell open. "What? No, I can't manage a business. I just work here." "Exactly," he replied softly. "You already know the heart of this place better than anyone. You've been running it in spirit for years. You just didn't have the title." Tasha shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll try," Richard said kindly. "I'll help you learn the rest." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "Why me?" she whispered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. The note she had written. "Because of this," he said. "You reminded me what matters. You reminded me why I started all of this in the first place." She covered her mouth, realizing what he meant. "You kept it?" "I'll never forget it," he said gently. "You said to remember people like you, people who are still fighting. Well, I intend to do that, starting right here." Within months, the diner transformed. The faded walls were repainted in bright, cheerful colors. The broken booths were replaced, and the old neon sign was restored to shine proudly again. A new coffee machine hummed behind the counter, and the smell of fresh pastries filled the air each morning. But the real change wasn't just in the walls or the furniture. It was in the people. Richard hired locals who had been out of work for years, giving them stable jobs and fair pay. He installed a small reading corner for kids and offered free meals to students who needed a quiet place to study. And right in the center of it all was Tasha, now wearing a name tag that read, "Manager." At first she was nervous. The responsibility felt huge. But with Richard's quiet guidance and her own determination, she grew into the role. She learned to handle orders, manage staff, and even balance the accounts. But more than that, she learned to believe in herself again. Every time a customer walked in and smiled, she felt a sense of pride she had never known before. One afternoon, a local reporter stopped by to write about the diner's miracle comeback. She asked Tasha what had changed. Tasha smiled softly and said, "Someone believed that small places like this and people like us still matter." When the story was published, it spread far beyond the neighborhood. People across the city began visiting the diner, not just for the food, but for what it represented: hope, kindness, and second chances. Richard never wanted attention for what he'd done. He kept his visits quiet, sitting in his usual spot by the window with a cup of black coffee. Sometimes he watched Tasha managing the floor, greeting customers and laughing with her staff. He felt proud, not of himself but of what she had become. One day as they closed up the diner together, Tasha turned to him and said, "You changed everything for us." Richard shook his head. "No, Tasha, you changed everything for me." She looked puzzled. "How do you mean?" He smiled. "Before I came here, I thought success was about building companies, creating wealth. But you showed me that real success is about lifting others. It's about remembering the people who keep fighting, even when no one's watching." She felt her eyes sting with emotion. "I just wrote a note," she said softly. And that note, he replied, became a movement. Years later, Sunnyside Cafe became a cornerstone of the community. It wasn't just a diner anymore, and it was a gathering place, a symbol of hope. The walls were decorated with photos of local families, and on the back wall, framed in simple wood, hung the note that had started it all. Customers would often ask about it, and Tasha would smile and say, "That note changed 2 lives, his and mine." As for Richard, he continued his undercover visits to other towns and cities, looking for more places, more people, who reminded him of Tasha. He didn't always reveal who he was. Sometimes he just left a tip or a kind word, or quietly paid someone's rent behind the scenes. He believed that kindness worked best when it came with no strings attached. And every time he looked at that note, the original, now slightly worn and creased from years of being carried around, he was reminded of the truth that had once stopped him cold. If you're ever in a position to make change, please remember people like us. We're still fighting. He kept his promise. And because of one brave waitress who dared to speak her heart, countless others found hope again. In the end, it wasn't money that changed the world around them. It was compassion, courage, and the power of one simple message written on a small piece of paper in a quiet little diner on a rainy morning.